Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Left Book Club event. For this event, I'll be interviewing Lynsey Hanley and discussing her book, Respectable, Crossing the Class Divide. My name is Elif, and I do the events and political education for the Left Book Club. Just before we get on to the discussion, I want to talk a little bit about what the Left Book Club is. So the Left Book Club is a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We publish collectible editions of radical and progressive books, which are uniquely available to our members, and we post them out each month so you get it right through your door. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education, aiming to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. Left Book Club events have featured some phenomenal speakers over the months, so feel free to check out the video library on our YouTube channel for discussions engaging with a wide range of radical thought. If you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click the Become a Member tab. And don't forget to follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with events, promotions, and giveaways. And while you're here tonight, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can also keep up to date with our events. So as I said, today's discussion will be more like an interview with the author of Respectable, Lynsey Hanley. And she is joining us today to discuss this book, the Left Book Club edition, or the Left Book Club version of it, which we've mostly kept it in its original form. And Lynsey Hanley was born in Birmingham and lives in Liverpool. She's the author of Estates, An Intimate History, and is a regular contributor to The Guardian and New Statesman. I'm sure I left some stuff about who Lynsey is, and she's obviously with us here right now. So Lynsey, do you want to also start by talking a little bit about yourself and what your background is?
Hi, yeah. Hi, Elif. Thank you for asking me to take part in this. Yeah, my name's Lynsey. I am a freelance journalist and a writer, and I make programs for radio. I grew up in Birmingham on a large council estate called Chelmsley Wood in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then I moved to London when I was 18 to go to university. I never went back to live in Birmingham or in Chelmsley Wood, where I'm from, but I've always maintained a connection. I've always maintained family connections there, and I've lived in Liverpool for 10 years. And I think my my main sort of aim in life, I suppose, really, or my main kind of obsession is with working through a lot of the experiences I had growing up on a large peripheral estate outside a big city, that was very kind of spatially and geographically and socially, economically kind of segregated from other parts of the city. And an interesting thing I found when I moved to London in 1994 when I was 18 is that I went from living on a peripheral council estate to living on an inner city council estate. And I was really, really interested by the similarities as well as the differences. There are a lot of really, really obvious differences in terms of just the sheer level of poverty that people were living in London compared to where I grew up in Birmingham. But there were so many similarities in the sense of the built environment, kind of I felt worked against people. Both on peripheral estates and on inner city estates. And it just led to this kind of like lifelong obsession with writing about and reading about and researching the relationship between people, between sort of how people live class, particularly in their built environment. So my first book was literally a social history of council estates called Estates, which came out in 2007, and which is still out with Granta Books. And then my second book, Respectable, which is what we're going to be talking about today, came out with Penguin in 2016, and sort of picks up from some of the aspects of what I wrote about in Estates that people kept coming back to me and saying, oh, that was the bit that they found most interesting. And a lot of what people said was most interesting about the first book was that it wasn't so much like the me discussing the ins and outs of council housing policy in Britain over the last 100 years. It was more about how we internalize class and about how the built environment affects you in terms of the limitations it presents and the resources it either provides or withholds, and how that affects your experience growing up and into adulthood, and how it affects your trajectory during adulthood, and how you can leave a place where you sort of know just inside yourself, that resources, economic resources, intellectual resources, like urban resources have been withheld from you. And if you can sort of do the whole social mobility thing, the whole social and economic mobility thing, and sort of technically enter the middle class, but you still kept that internalized sense of, shame and deficiency and lack of confidence, really. So in a way, I feel like the two books sort of, the first one was a sort of more concrete discussion, literally, of the built environment, and then the second one was more about the psychology of the social psychology of class, almost, really. So yeah, that's how I came to write those books, really, and that's what I tried and write about in my journalism as well.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for that, Lynsey. I think it's really important and useful to kind of understand that process as well. So what you've just described about some of these like internalized, which we'll talk a bit about later, actually, essentially these internalized feelings of inability, which you do also talk about in Respectable, but we'll get onto that. I want to talk a bit about I find this quite interesting, and I think people who will be watching this interview, and particularly our members, will want to perhaps know your thoughts and again process of this as well. So the book is quite there's a heavy memoir aspect of the book.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not limited to that, which I think is what makes the book very interesting and important. It feels like it's not just purely about lived experience, but it's trying to place some of this, through essentially like a memoir aspect, it's trying to place that in some sort of like contextualize it and in some sort of theory as well, without like also kind of allowing it to take over. I think it'll be interesting to know a bit about why you chose to write the book in that way, with this memoir aspect and placing it in the way you did. And how did you think that that format would I suppose contribute to communicating the ideas of the book? Because clearly this isn't just publishing your diary, you're trying to do something here. How did you think it would contribute to communicating the ideas? And also lastly, just because I think it's all connected, the book is in two parts, and I kind of want to understand why you chose to do it that way. And then there's Respectable in the 80s and Respectable in 90s chapters, which there is a description of the experience, but there's obviously, again, it's not limited to that. Why did you choose to do the book in this way?
I think really because I've got quite a sort of photographic memory. Well, not photographic, kind of like quite a synesthetic memory. I think that's the word. I don't know. In that I can remember extremely clearly the sensations and the sort of images of lots of pivotal events from when I was growing up. And I think because I learnt to read when I was very little, I was very ill a lot when I was little. And I didn't have any siblings, so I used to stay in a lot. And I learnt to read when I was very little, and my mum and dad always had a paper lying around, always had a newspaper lying around. It was always the Daily Mirror. And I write about this quite a lot in the book, is like how the Daily Mirror was this really, really formative influence on my kind of thinking, in that it was a really, we know it to be quite a populist paper, but one that, one that, tries valiantly to present a kind of centre left perspective in comparison with other tabloids, Um, and when I was very little, I remember it being very tabloidy and still sort of quite trashy, but it always had these really, really intensive discussions of political developments in them. And my dad was always obsessed with having the news on when we were having our tea. So those sorts of things, those sort of classed experiences of, having your tea in the living room on a tray in front of the telly, it was always the 6 o'clock news. And the 6 o'clock news in the 80s was like this kind of continuous hellscape. It was like,
Not
um,
entirely different now, right?
no, it's not really different, but it was much more, the geopolitics was so obvious and intense at the time, because, like almost every news report, it felt like, of course, felt like, um, it wasn't just strikes, it was the impact of the continuing impact of the oil crisis. I remember being very, very tiny and hearing about, the Iran-Iraq war, and about Russia invading Afghanistan, and nuclear arms races, and Ronald Reagan, and all this kind of stuff. So I was very, very tiny and couldn't process this information, but I really, really got a very, very early sense that there was a bit of a world out there, and that if it was being read out on the news, then it obviously had some relevance to us. Although it was very hard to, sort of make that relationship. But then the Daily Mirror would always have these discussions of, moving on forward a few years later, would always have these discussions of Mrs. Thatcher and how evil Mrs. Thatcher was, and the miners' strike, and and Neil Kinnock, and so on. I'm really showing my age here, I was born in the mid-70s, so and all these things seemed like scarily relevant at the same time as pop stars seemed extremely relevant, and pop music seemed extremely relevant. And I think because I had a very sort of staying in a lot, I had a bit of a overactive imagination, I think those memories have always stayed with me incredibly strongly. And I was very, very much aware, like when I was at school, that I had an interest in sort of political affairs and social affairs that other kids just thought was completely weird and didn't see how it was relevant to their lives. And what's the point? You can't change anything anyway, because I think that's what they're, that's what you grow up hearing at home. Is kind of, all politicians are all tossers, and you've got no effect over anything. We're just here to be stamped on, basically. And I think my mum and dad had this interest in politics, but it sort of coexisted with the sense that you couldn't do anything about it. And so I was this sort of like angry child, kind of like, yeah, but you've got to be able to do something about it. You've got to. And those things are really, really formative and always stayed with me. And I think have always informed my political outlook. So when it came to write about class, I sort of couldn't do it in any other way. Genuinely, I couldn't write a purely theoretical book. I mean, my experiences in education that they weren't terrible academic wise, but also they weren't great either. I did well at the schools I went to, which were my primary and secondary schools were both on the estate where I grew up, which was also very, very formative. I didn't have an experience of sort of being bussed out of the estate to a posher school, or passing the 11 plus or anything like that. I was schooled exclusively up to the age of 16, on the estate, on estate schools, that were, particularly our secondary school was, basically crumbling in the 80s, was falling to bits, was hideously under-resourced, was incredibly unpopular. It had been built as this, kind of like a showcase comprehensive school in 1970, where the kids, in 1970, the kids, they didn't have to wear uniforms to go to school. They didn't have to call their teachers Mr. or Miss. They were encouraged to call their teachers by their first names. It was meant to be really, really progressive. But I think these ideals came up really, really hard against the realities of, a very, very extremely large council estate where people's expectations had already been sort of like trammeled in a certain way. Um, so, I did all right at school, but then I really, really struggled at university. Managed to get a place at university, but it wasn't, I wasn't that well supported at university, and came away feeling very, sort of quite down on, on too much theory and too much abstraction, I guess, because I'd always struggled with it at university. And so my sort of entrance into sort of like reading about, reading Bourdieu and, Richard Sennett and other sort of quite significant like theorists of class just came from just trying to continue my education myself a bit because I hadn't done that great at university. And so I was never going to be able to write a sort of super theory heavy book because I just don't have that level of confidence with the material, but I just have a personal interest in it. And also I'm just very, very sort of like very, very entrenched. It was just very, very deeply like personally entrenched in sort of just popular culture and just like an interest in everyday life and I think it expresses itself in my writing quite colloquially. So I've got quite a sort of colloquial style of writing, really. So whether people find that helpful, in that they find it conversational, or whether they find it sort of irritatingly unintellectual, I've got no idea. But that's how it came out anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's an interesting and refreshing way to try and put some ideas across. And I think, like I said before, it feels as though, this isn't just like a declaration of, one's experience, but it is also trying to do something. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that, as in what was there, and if so, what was the desired like outcome you were trying to create, or the impact you wanted it to have on readers? It would do, is it to understand this experience? Is it to, what I guess, what were you trying to do? And like, was it to try and get readers to reflect differently on their own class background growing up? Because you also talk about, especially the entrance is like this desire for self-improvement and almost this like the needs versus wants, discussion in a way.
Yeah.
And I find that personally quite interesting as well. I guess there could be we could have an entire discussion just on that matter, I suppose. But yeah, is it to try and get people to reflect on their own class backgrounds, make sense of like some of these things? Or, what is it trying to do? Is it trying to get people to take act, what's the impact you wanted the book to have?
Yeah, I think partly I wanted it to sort of be, to be educative. I wanted people to be informed by it. I think in particular, I sort of had a sort of urge as I got a little bit older to really, really try and get down some of the experiences of what it was like to live through Thatcherism and where it was like particularly to live, um, as a working class, child, going through education, going through the education system under Thatcherism, but also the impact of growing up, under what you're only dimly aware of, but well, I personally, luckily, I guess, was only dimly aware of, but obviously so many people experience this very, very directly from a very young age, is sort of a sort of just an atmosphere of the knowledge that the state is and can be incredibly violent. I think, the state and states can be. I think, you know, my parents and grandparents felt very felt that the state was, you know, a sort of a munificent state. You know, it was a beneficial state, a caring state, because it had housed them, you know, all their lives. The state had housed them. It had housed them sort of pretty well, you know, like just in terms of bricks and mortar, it housed them pretty well. Um, Eventually, after a long time on the waiting list, you know, did eventually house them pretty well. You know, they got a house with a garden. You know, basically that was everything they ever wanted, was a house with a garden. And they didn't reflect, you know, consciously at least, too much on the fact that the house, the sort of the price of the house with the garden was being sort of like flung, you know, 10 miles outside of the city, sort of thing,
Mhm.
you know, and sort of flung away from everything that they knew and had grown up with, sort of thing, that it was that it came with a price. And that they didn't have much sort of control or autonomy over where they were housed and so on. They were just really, really pleased that they had a house with a garden. But I think, you know, for whatever reason, I just grew up feeling very, very, very angry. And I know that so much of that was influenced by the knowledge of, you know, the knowledge of the bomb, the knowledge of the arms race. Um, Again, you know, seeing Greenham Common protesters on the telly thing, and like instinctively knowing that what they were doing was right, even though I was really, really, really small. You know, that it was that it was wrong to, you know, you know, designate a, you know, a bunch of fields as a place where America could put nuclear missiles on. You know what I mean? It's just insanity, just insane levels of you know, implied and, you know, implied and threatened, you know, violence, you know, and then, you know, and then seeing footage every day from the miners' strike again.
Mhm.
You know, my extended family are from South Wales, are from Mardy, which again I write about in Respectable, about how my great grandma, um, her husband was a miner, and died from the consequences of basically having half a seam of coal fall on his chest in the, you know, in the 20s. And again, that's sort of the idea that I remember my nan just always going on about how grateful she was all the time. She was grateful for her pension and she was grateful for her house. And for whatever reason, I think I just tended to focus sort of mentally on the kind of, well, you can't be very grateful that, you know, that your dad died when he was 31, you know, because of his work. You know, surely, you know, that's, you know, and just that thing of thinking, well, you know, that the state has sort of granted us a certain level of comfort that, you know, back in Mardy, you know, in desperate poverty can't even have been imagined. But, you know, if you look at how, you know, kind of if you look at how the other half lived, you know, we're still just getting the crumbs, you know. And I was just always focused, for whatever reason, I was just always really, really focused on the on the negatives rather than the positives, you know. Um, but you know, I mean, how else does, you know, how else does change occur? You know, if you don't say, well, we've got this, but how about the next bit? You know, how about more? Um, so I think I was desperate to get across a sense of what it was like growing up in those times, and
Mhm.
desperate to sort of communicate a sense of sort of political and social context for the times that we're living in now. Um, and also, I mean, the thing is, bear in mind that, you know, Respectable took years and years to write, and it was all finished and out before, you know, the sort of the present sort of like ongoing wave of disruptions, you know, that obviously have very deep roots, but you know, it happened, you know, I finished writing it, you know, before Brexit, you know, before Donald Trump, you know, before coronavirus, before I actually wrote most of it, I think even, uh, I suppose I wrote most of it in sort of like quite the early days of the coalition, so in the early days of austerity and stuff like that. So to look back on it, you know, from a perspective of what's happened since, you know,
Mhm.
everything that I talk about, you know, about division and about culture wars, and about when you strip resources from people, you know, it can have all sorts of unanticipated effects, as well as the really, really obvious ones, that I was writing before all that happened, but was basically, it feels like, uh, not that I was predicting it, obviously, because I'm not psychic, but sort of basically saying that the divisions that get talked a lot, now in the sort of liberal press, has been sort of quite sudden and, oh my gosh, can you believe what's happened in the last 5 years? All these things, they have much, 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 much
Yeah.
deeper roots than that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question, really. I suppose it's one of those things, like I felt so internally motivated to write it. It's almost like the idea of who I was trying to communicate it to was almost like secondary, really. It was just like a desire to sort of just put something out there and hope that it connects with people.
Yeah. Well, I think as like to continue from that, I think what's related is you talk about Michael Lerner's theory of surplus powerlessness to
Oh yeah.
explain why relatively few working class, like, well, particularly, I guess, adults challenge like unfair working practices and, so on, like a myriad of things, and some of the things that you've also spoke about. And you also quote Leonard talking about the idea of powerlessness corrupts because it persuades us that nothing can really change. And this is, you were just talking about that, and also asking for more, believing you can change things. And I think you reflected on like that, experiencing or kind of, I guess, observing that in your parents as well, but also around you. I guess, can you tell us a little bit more about that element of things? Because I'm interested to hear, I suppose, what you think, if this is one of the foundations or something that really informs what we see on the left and what is often referred to as defeatism. Because sometimes it's, sometimes I feel like it comes in the form of just simply not even taking action and believing it can't change. Sometimes it shows itself in the form of attempting something, but actually in a way like withdrawing quite quickly, or even while you're doing something, just not believing that it's going to have an impact, but doing it anyway. And I wonder what you think, or how you think that impacts the actual doing it, even if you are.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, when I discovered that Michael Lerner book, which obviously is written in an American context, but it was based on some of his experiences, I think, as a psychologist and I think as a trade union activist in Oakland, in the US in the 80s. I identified with it really, really closely because growing up, I was repeatedly told by adults basically that everything's a joke. Everything's a joke. Other people are jokers. They're just out to get you. There's no point in believing in anything. There's no point in being sincere, really. Actually, there's no point in being sincere, and that the way to sort of get through life really is to adopt a quite hardened position, really, of being quite mistrustful, of focusing very closely on your just on your family members, really, and sort of basically dismissing all dismissing all political action as having some kind of vested interest, and not actually done because people really believe in the cause, and of course this has unbelievably grim reactionary consequences. I mean, when fast forward quite a number of years, like I was saying to people, at the time that sort of Brexit happened, I was writing for The Guardian quite a lot. And, I used to almost kind of like giggle at the sort of the intense surprise that everybody would have about, oh my God, isn't it terrible? Can you believe that people would vote against their own interests? And, can't they see that the EU is incredibly beneficial to everybody? Isn't it terrible? Oh, soon people will come to their senses. People need to be educated so that they can be very rational, all this kind of stuff. And I just used to be like, oh my God, Chelmsley Wood. I looked up the vote percentage for Chelmsley Wood, where I grew up, like in the weeks afterwards, and it was 73% Leave. And I was like, yep, that's the place I grew up, definitely. Literally does not surprise. In fact, I'm only surprised that it wasn't higher. you know, the sort of the sentiments that have led to, sort of Johnson being elected and people voting Tory for the first time, in so-called red wall seats and stuff like that. That kind of outlook of, not even don't dare to sort of hope for something different or to try and work towards something different, but they're kind of, they're all as bad as each other. So, we might as well vote for a complete clown because at least it's given us some entertainment at the same time. Those were the kinds of sentiments that were very, very familiar to me when I was growing up. And, as a kid, I was one of these sort of like cause, sort of sort of causey type people, so I was really into recycling, really into recycling, and I was really into, you know, sort of, doing things that I saw on Blue Peter, like things like that. And, in retrospect, I can see that they were quite classed, like, my background is very, very firmly working class, but there were these sort of like tinges of, there were these kind of like lower middle class kind of tinges to my background. My dad was a clerical worker, whereas, all my mates, their mums and dads worked in, factories and shops and stuff like that. My mum worked in a shop as well, but my dad was a clerical worker. And it did sort of set us apart kind of slightly. And I think, in retrospect, I think that thing of sort of wanting to be keen and wanting to be respectable, which again, I talk about so much in the book about, this idea of working class respectability, all those things sort of came quite naturally to me. But it also had this sort of what my peers experienced as being this like fundamentally embarrassing and kind of quite pointless sincerity and hopefulness, like it was just like hopelessly naive, and I've stayed that way. Still hopelessly naive now, but I just I don't know, that's what some people would call it. I prefer to call it optimistic.
I guess it's also called hopeful, like being.
Yeah, exactly.
I also see this it feel like particularly in some diaspora communities. I'm Kurdish, so I'm also very much in touch with the Kurdish diaspora in London and in other parts of Britain. And you really see this where there is this, there's nothing going to change, but also there's this, because it's also, we're here now, we've had to leave our lands, and how can it get worse? And actually nothing's going to change. And in fact, the change is what makes people uncomfortable. Like, even if that change is going to bring freedom eventually, or some more like egalitarian or equality, or some positive change, essentially, that change is uncomfortable for people. So I feel like often the voting for example, is against self-interest, is also because it's just the evil we know. That's often what it is as well. I think, I'm sure there's like whatever he might be entertaining element with some of this stuff, but I think it's the understanding that, what, they're both evil, and we'll just go for the evil that's more certain.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I find this in a lot of places. And I wonder, I guess one could do a long and deep exploration on this. I do think there's like, cultural elements to it. I think it's really decades and decades, and if not centuries, of just, that kind of, whether it's in, culture or wherever it is, it's like this is this high and mighty system around you, and actually nothing's going to take it down. And so why are you even bothering? You know, you can do it to kind of satisfy yourself, but why are you even bothering? Because you're not really going to be able to penetrate the system in any kind of meaningful or central way. So yeah, I think there would be a lot to, I mean, there's so much we could discuss, but I think we don't have too much time. But one of the things I really wanted to ask you is, in the book you also quote Diane Ray, who talks about the topic of choice. Now, you know, again, I guess one could talk very long about this, but she talks about choice in education, that the working class have largely ended up with the choices that the middle class do not want to make. And you also speak a bit about the different expectations for working class girls versus working class boys. You know, for instance, when you recall girls at school discussing if they should get engaged at 15 or wait until just after leaving school. I mean, I wonder if you see like a connection between this, if you see a connection between the education system. I suspect it's obviously not at all limited to just the experience of the education system. But yeah, how do you think that relates to each other? You know, especially I guess what I'm trying to get out here is, you know, we've heard a lot, we've discussed and heard a lot about the working class experience, but how does this, like, what is the gender element to this as well? Like, how do for example working class girls, when they're at school, working class women feel this differently?
Yeah. I think things have changed to an extent for girls across the board since I was at school. I think you know, I mean, you can see it obviously in the um, representation of young women in further and higher education now, that um, girls and young women are by far more likely, far more likely to stay on at school after 16 than boys of all classes now, where it becomes more and more pronounced by class background. So working class girls and women are much more likely proportionally than working class boys and young men to stay in education after 16 or 18. And I mean, Diane Ray is you know, somebody who has done so much valuable research into the interplay, I guess, the interplay between teachers, between school teachers who are, you know, both sort of, you know, technically by profession, you know, and often, you know, by, you know, habitus, you know, in the Bourdieuan sense, habitus in terms of, you know, sort of like, you know, place of dwelling and type of dwelling and sort of, you know, cultural and economic choices, middle class, and that kind and the way um and the way you know, sort of teachers' responses to and interactions with working class boys in particular kind of serve to, you know, intensify the class difference between them, sort of thing. Um, I mean, not only Diane Ray, but Paul Willis, who wrote the book Learning to Labour back in the early 70s, who did a sociological study of how working class boys, you know, very almost rationally, really, sort of like rationally disengaged from the education system because it is really fundamentally alien to working class working practices, you know, in terms of the type of job that they basically instinctively know that they're going to end up going into, you know, which relies on, you know, sort of a kind of, you know, banter, really, you know, kind of like homosocial bonding, sort of basically needing other guys to kind of like have your back rather than sort of just individual advancement. You know, you know you're going to be, you're going to be the worker, not the foreman, you know, or the supervisor or whatever, you know. So Paul Willis sort of did an absolutely brilliant study of how working class boys, particularly once they're into secondary education, sort of basically sort of start to treat, as in life, as in life, like treat the education system and treat the actual practice of attempting to be taught, of teachers attempting to teach them, as a massive joke, basically, and sort of spend the whole time trying to get one over on the teacher, like trying to develop in jokes, trying to develop solidarity within the group, even though it's completely deleterious to their educational prospects and so on. But that sort of that sort of sense of, like self-improvement through education or individual advancement through education, is not necessarily seen as something that's going to kind of basically destroy women's or girls' kind of solidarity with each other over time. And so the way, teaching and the education system, is kind of like set up as a whole, it basically tries to turn all kids, whether or not they start out this way, basically tries to turn all kids middle class. And depending on your background, and as you say, the interplay of class, class, gender, race, geography, all these things, you're either going to say, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, I think I too can become middle class, which sounds really great. when I'm a grown up, I'd like to be middle class, or you can think, oh my God, what an evil thing to sort of try and propagate on on an entire sort of generation of people, and like fundamentally reject it, I guess. And I think sort of the New Labour period was a real sort of experiment in trying to create a whole generation of middle class kids, purely through the technocratic levers of the education system. And clearly it didn't work, because it's not the right thing to do in the first place when it comes down to it.
Yeah. I mean, there's two more questions that I want to ask you, and I wonder if we'll have you talk you talk a little bit about the the racism that you saw when you were growing up, and some of those experiences. How do you think this also plays, with some of the things you've spoken about today? And also, you talk about when you were talking about I think it's towards the end, I can't quite remember what chapter it was in, but the justification of voting for UKIP, and this that it can't be purely understood in a
Mm-hmm.
purely material way, or or an economic material way. And how do you think that kind of that also relates to some of the discussion of racism that you talk about, like that you saw while you were growing up?
Yeah. Well, like I was saying before, I didn't, I sort of struggled, sort of earlier in life, with sort of, getting a hold on, sort of theory and theories kind of thing. But one, sort of idea that I did come across that I've found really, really compelling, and that I've, come back to all the time now, is the idea of ressentiment, Max Weber's theory of ressentiment, which essentially is the idea that particularly men, but not always men, particularly men from who are regarded to be sort of like the dominant group in other ways, i.e. white, white European white European men, often from working class, sort of slightly upper working class, or sort of like petty bourgeois backgrounds, basically developing a sense of grievance that goes way over and above their actual material conditions. And ressentiment is about a sense of kind of aggrieved entitlement. So not the sort of kind of breezy entitlement that the actual elite have, the kind of Boris Johnson levels of entitlement, where like everything's just mine and it's there for the taking. This is more a sense of I have some things, yes, but there are some things that I should have that I don't have, and I don't understand why I have them. Therefore, I'm going to cast around for people and things and processes to blame for this. And ressentiment, when I read about this concept, it just made complete sense to me in the context of, again, sort of mostly men, and or, like 99.9% white men that I knew growing up, which is that they weren't the poorest of the poor. They weren't desperately poor. They were working. They struggled every day. They struggled. They often had health conditions relating to stress and work and sort of basic, the basic difficulty of making ends meet. But still had a car. Had a roof over their heads and so on. But were absolutely obsessively racist. Not just sort of boringly, casually racist, which the Tories make political hay out of all the time, but kind of like obsessively just obsessively racist. And this was a perception that that they've been cast out to the outskirts of the city, in order to make way for, sort of, marauding hordes of people from other countries, who didn't behave like them and, didn't follow the rules and all that kind of stuff. But it was really, really obsessive. Like if there was just a problem, if there was a problem that had absolutely nothing to do with race, it would always be brought back to race. If, parts of Birmingham when I was growing up were, in very obvious states of decay, because the council had run out of money, because the government didn't care, would be brought back to race, inevitably. Oh, this place was great until, started moving, and, the whole thing, and this idea that Birmingham was somehow kind of racially segregated because of the choices of the people who lived there, except it was only the white people who didn't have choices. Like white people had been made to move out, had been made to do this, had been made to live like this, and people from the Caribbean or people from South Asia, like had all made choices to move to Birmingham and so on, and have this apparently wonderful life that was denied to all the white people, and to me it had literally no basis in reality. But I was constantly again sort of reminded of my kind of naivety and my sort of inherently suspicious kind of do-goodiness for just sort of pointing out that racism is really evil,
Yeah.
and that also the things that they blame and the people that they blame were not actually the causes for the problems that they had. And so ressentiment is this theme that I do sort of make quite a bit out of in the book, because it made a huge amount of sense, and it is something that is being it's always played on sort of implicitly anyway, but it's just become a lot more explicit in recent years, and the Tories are trying really, really hard to see how far they can take it. And I think it probably has limits that they're not aware of. The culture war, the sort of the very sort of relentless study of the culture war. It has limits that they're not quite aware of because of their own privileged position. I think there does come a point with most working class people that they do have to admit you know, whether to each other or to themselves or to other people, they do have to admit that the things that they blame aren't actually the real causes of the things that are the real cause of their problems. Not for everybody, obviously, but I think because the Tories are so completely ignorant, and particularly completely ignorant of the sort of like newer constituencies that they're representing and the people who live them, you know, like really, really willfully ignorant, you know, as evidenced by the levelling up, you know, by the contents of the levelling up paper, you know. So willfully ignorant of the people that they represent. I don't think they realise that you know, they're going to run out of road and that it does have limits. But it's now it's up to Labour. Now it's up to Labour to just knock it on the head, and I don't think they're going to be honest, because they feel like they can get some mileage out of it as well. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this would be again a very long discussion to have about
Yeah.
the future of these political parties and what is, I guess, what is necessary to take people forward.
Yeah.
And whether it should ever just be through political parties, or what, you know, or whether, and I'm definitely of this camp, that there is a need for actual community organizing and mobilizing communities, but also
Absolutely, yeah.
but also not like also you know, also not even just skilling them up, because often people, you know, who do try and make ends meet and you know, have lived not in great conditions, let's put it, you know, not great material conditions, they do have the skills to actually organize themselves and mobilize, because often it was necessary for survival.
Yeah.
So actually kind of develop some sort of a strategy or whatever it might be, understanding that actually you don't even need to organize these communities or tell these communities how to organize, but organize with them. And you know, then that I can only imagine would create some quite profound results that have not been seen here for a while.
Yeah.
You know, across Britain. And obviously, as we know, there's many factors that impact this, and one of them is and I think you do touch on, and obviously you're also a journalist, how the media portrays working class people as well, or just how the media portrays things, but you know, for this discussion, working class people. And you know, it's been a discussion throughout the years, particularly during election periods, as you mentioned, like, you know, some of these parties seeing it as like something that they can use. But you know, even though working class people have been so, like, have been a tool or so weaponized in various different ways, and you know, again, like the working class people versus like the black and brown people, like this has been such a, but not much, you know, and even though there has also been critique of this, not much has changed in like the fabric or structure of particularly mainstream media. But there has been some, you know, particularly newer left media projects, I mean also right wing media projects that have come about. I guess one of the things is, why do you think the mainstream media hasn't really changed? Do you think there is some sort of work to do there and like hope to be had to try and change the mainstream media within, or do you think it's important to support some of these like newer left media projects? And I guess, what do you think of them?
Well, I think there's absolutely a need for both. You know, I mean, I think, you know, things. I mean, I grew up just completely, you know, as I said, you know, just completely sort of absorbed in the sort of like the messages of mainstream media, and I think because of the sort of times I grew up in, you know, I was a child sort of in the early days of Channel 4 and so on, and at a time when a lot of sort of 60s and 70s, you know, sort of like quite radical filmmakers and dramatists and so on were still given a very, you know, fairly sort of like thorough hearing on, you know, on the main channels, on the main TV channels, and so on. And so I think I have a residual strength of feeling for the necessity of, you know, kind of mass media vehicles, I suppose, really, because of the way that mass media works, the sheer reach of its audience. If you can sort of tip the balance back in favor of kind of a genuine diversity of content and viewpoints, not just in the sort of the messages put across, but in the actual form as well, sort of like more formally experimental content, in the sorts of things that, I grew up with, kind of completely crazy stuff I grew up watching on Channel 4 as a kid. There is a place for that, because, I just think to myself, well, there I was, this kid in, so many working class people who grew up in the 70s and 80s in particular, like sort of bond over these experiences of things like, watching Derek Jarman films, in some random council house, in any part of the country, oh my god, we got exposed to Derek Jarman films just because they were on the telly, just because they're on normal telly. So I think that there is still an absolutely essential place for mass forms, as long as it's not complete guff all the time. But I am really encouraged by some of the new left platforms, although I feel quite out of touch, I think, because of my age, and I think a lot of people involved in them are so much younger than me and grew up in a totally different time. I'm really encouraged by the fact that they exist, and I think the way in which people, sort of like savvy people have made use of social media to, disseminate messages that that aren't getting enough leverage in traditional media forms and so on. I am encouraged by that. But I suppose the thing that worries me, I guess, is do they continue to stay quite niche? They continue to stay quite niche, and how do you broaden those things out? I always feel like the way you broaden things out is by making a real attempt to I don't know, just sort of be more direct and be more honest about how you communicate, be more conversational. I think sometimes people mistake sort of being conversational in how they communicate with just being really, really populist, and sort of like, sometimes you get sort of like middle class people like talking how they think working class people speak, which is always ends up being really, really embarrassing. And I think that's where representation comes in. Not just representation, of working class people by people who aren't and never have been working class, but like actually enabling working class people to actually, do some of the message giving themselves,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this has been so interesting, Lynsey. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would want to say?
I'm not sure really. I suppose just, because Respectable has been out a few years now, and I think one thing I find interesting is that, people do occasionally get in touch with me about it, and often, it's with quite a sort of like, a bit of a beef about it, I suppose, really, a beef, which is that, sometimes people have got in touch with me to say that, they feel that I prioritize, what I consider to be sort of like cultural markers of class over material and economic markers of class. And I suppose all I can say is that, that the book I can't rewrite the book now. But I did write it before the Corbyn era, and the Corbyn era did change me in a way, because it did actually do the thing that, I was saying, which is that it did actually for a while seem as though all the things that I believed in might actually have some kind of leverage, might actually finally have some actual political leverage and actually have a chance of gaining power. And that energized me to a really, really massive extent, and sort of made me sort of legitimize in myself the sort of a lot of the more, much more left-wing beliefs that I've always had underneath. But I think because I came of age during the Tony Blair period, I was always like really, really kind of like, oh, well, that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. So I'm not going to think about that, Let's just focus on sure start centres, And I suppose it kind of, the Corbyn, Corbyn sort of Corbyn McDonnell era kind of thing did sort of shake me up and make me realise that no, I do have to engage with the, with the sort of the material sort of realities, as well as the sort of, the HP source versus daddy source debate as well, which was much more much more in keeping with the things that I sort of like grew up with, as sort of how I internalized class. But of course, like ultimately, a lot of the things that I and my peers did internalize about class was just simply, lack of resources, and lack of, just really, really fundamental sort of dispossession and lack of respect by the state,
Yeah.
So yeah. It's sort of like things changed inside me in the time since I wrote the book. So, I suppose if there ever came a chance to sort of, I don't know, write a new little sort of preface or introduction to it or something like that, I would probably say, well, I wrote this at a specific time, and and things happened that sort of further politicized me in the meantime.
Wow. I mean, I think that's a lovely note to end our discussion on. Thank you very much for this, Lynsey. I mean, I feel like I could have spoken to you for hours on all of this and branch out into many, many different areas.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everyone who is watching this would have found this very interesting as well. Before we end, I just wanted to say, please visit leftbookclub.com if you want to become a member, and follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with our events, our projects and promotions and giveaways. And again, as you're watching this, please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, thank you so much, Lynsey, for joining us for this interview. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to watch this. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.